All right, let's dive into processor architectures, not just for techies. We're talking investments, specifically for companies like ARM, Intel, and AMD.
It's a big deal. The choices these companies make really matter for investors.
Huge ripple effects. And speaking of big news, Qualcomm just canceled their Snapdragon dev kit. Apparently, it wasn't up to snuff, didn't meet their quality standards. They're even giving money back to folks who bought it.
Yeah, refunds all around.
Now, this matters for investors because Qualcomm's been making a big push into PCs, right? They want to take on Intel and AMD with ARM-based processors, but this kind of throws a wrench in things.
Definitely raises questions about their strategy and execution.
For sure.
But hold on, maybe we should back up for a sec. Some folks might not even know what a dev kit is.
True.
Simply put, it's a package of tools, both hardware and software, so developers can build and test applications for a specific platform. In this case, Qualcomm's Snapdragon platform.
Gotcha.
So this cancellation, it's a bit of a red flag for Qualcomm's PC ambitions.
Okay, so that's the headline news. But let's zoom out, look at the bigger picture. ARM architecture has been making waves for a while now, especially because it's super energy efficient.
That's the key.
It's already huge in mobile devices.
Dominant, really.
And it's starting to push into servers and even PCs.
It all comes down to design. ARM processors use a simplified instruction set. That means they need less power to get things done. Plus, they usually run at lower clock speeds, so even less energy used.
Makes sense.
And this is a big deal these days, right? We've got mobile devices everywhere, data centers growing like crazy. Everyone wants to be more energy efficient.
Reduce that carbon footprint.
Exactly.
So if you're an investor interested in mobile tech, cloud computing, even the Internet of Things, companies using ARM start to look pretty good.
They're definitely worth a look.
But it's not just one company, right? ARM Holdings, Pella Mac, they're the ones behind the architecture, but they license it out to others.
Right, like Qualcomm, Samsung, they design and make the actual ARM-based processors.
So it's an ecosystem.
Exactly, an ecosystem, not a single entity. And that means investors need to look at the individual players, their strategies.
Makes sense.
Oh, and speaking of Qualcomm, there's another twist that might worry some investors.
Uh-oh, what's that?
Well, ARM Holdings Spooljack is in a legal battle with Qualcomm right now. They're canceling a license that let Qualcomm use ARM's intellectual property for their chip designs.
Oh, that's a big deal.
It could have a huge impact on what Qualcomm can do in the future.
So ARM has potential, but also some challenges.
Yeah.
What about the other big players, Intel and AMD? They use x86 architecture, right?
Yep, x86-64 to be precise. They've been the top dogs for decades, especially in desktops and data centers. They're known for raw power.
So if I'm looking at investments in high-performance stuff like gaming, video editing, complex simulations, Intel and AMD are still the ones to watch.
Absolutely.
There's always a but.
There is, and it's a big one. x86 is powerful, but it's not as energy efficient as ARM.
Ah, so there's the trade-off.
Exactly. Intel and AMD are constantly innovating, trying to catch up with ARM's efficiency without losing performance.
So for investors, it's all about how they're staying competitive.
That's the key question. Are they developing new chip designs that use less power? Investing in new manufacturing to make more efficient chips?
I need to see they're not just sitting back, resting on their laurels.
Exactly. And remember, things are changing. ARM is moving into data centers, a market Intel and AMD have owned for years.
Okay, so we've got the established players, we've got ARM making moves. What about those alternatives we hear about, like RISC-V?
Ah, RSCV, that's one a wash. It's open source, which means anyone can use and modify it. No licensing fees to ARM.
So that's got to be appealing for companies who want to make custom processors.
Incredibly appealing.
Could really level the playing field for smaller companies and startups.
It has that potential, but investors need to be careful. Open source can be a double-edged sword. It can mean lots of innovation.
That's the good side.
It is. But it can also mean fragmentation. There's no single company controlling RACV development.
So it's harder to predict who'll come out on top.
Exactly.
Interesting. So RACV is both opportunity and risk, but it's not the only alternative, right? What else is out there?
Well, Qualcomm is trying to play both sides. They've got their Snapdragon X Elite, which is aiming to challenge both ARM and x86 in high-performance devices.
So they're going for the top spot.
They are. Then you've got companies like Ampere. They're focusing on ARM-based server processors specifically for the cloud.
Smart. The cloud is booming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we can't forget the specialized architectures, like Apple's M-series chips.
Showing that there's room for niche players.
Absolutely.
Lots of options for investors.
Yeah, son.
No single best architecture. It all depends on what you're looking for.
It's all about understanding the strengths and weaknesses. Which architecture works best for which application, the companies competing in each market, and the bigger tech trends driving demand for different processors.
A lot to consider.
It is, but that's what makes it such an exciting market. That's exactly it. So let's talk about what makes each architecture the best and what that means for your investments.
Okay, let's break it down. We've talked about how energy efficient ARM is, especially for mobile devices and data centers. But how does that translate to actual investment opportunities?
Well, think about the big players in those areas. Smartphone companies, cloud computing giants, even those developing the next generation of IoT devices.
Right, those are huge markets.
Massive. And they all want better battery life, lower energy consumption, and lower costs. So for them, ARM is super attractive.
So as an investor, I should look at companies that either make ARM-based processors or are deeply tied into the ARM ecosystem.
Exactly. And remember, it's an ecosystem, not just one company. You have ARM Holdings Bialik, which licenses the architecture, and then the manufacturers like Qualcomm, Samsung, MediaTek actually making the processors. You need to understand how each player fits in.
Gotcha. So different companies, different roles, different potential investments. Makes sense. Now, what about Buy 8664? We know it's the powerhouse behind desktops and data centers. What's the investment angle there?
Well, Buy 86 is all about performance. Think about the companies that need that raw power. Gaming companies making those graphically intense games, video editing software companies, companies doing complex simulations, even financial institutions running high-frequency trading algorithms.
Wow. So lots of different industries rely on that kind of horsepower.
Absolutely. And that's where Intel and AMD come in.
So they're still the go-to for investors in those markets.
They are, but here's the catch. We talked about how ARM is becoming more competitive, especially in data centers, so you can't just assume Intel and AMD will stay on top forever.
Things change fast in the tech world.
You said it, so you need to watch how they're innovating, how they're staying ahead of the curve.
What kind of innovation are we talking about? Give me some examples.
Well, one area is chip design. Both Intel and AMD are always working on new architectures that give even more performance, but also use less power.
So they're trying to get the best of both worlds.
Exactly. And then there's fabrication technology. They're investing tons of money into new manufacturing processes so they can make smaller, more efficient chips.
As an investor, I'd be looking at the research and development spending, any partnerships they have, and any news about breakthroughs in those areas, right?
Exactly. You want to see they're not resting on their laurels, that they're actively pushing the boundaries of what Buy 86 can do.
All right, so that's Buy 8664. Now let's move on to RISC-V. We talked about how it's open source, which can be both a good and bad thing. How should investors approach this architecture?
Well, open source has the potential to really shake things up. It means companies can make custom processors tailored to their exact needs without being tied to ARM's licensing agreements. This could lead to a wave of innovation from smaller companies and startups that couldn't afford to compete before.
So for investors looking for high growth potential, RISC-V is definitely worth checking out.
Definitely. But remember, open source can mean things are fragmented. There's no one controlling RISC-V development, so there will probably be tons of companies working on it, each with their own approach.
So I need to be careful about picking the right companies. I can't just assume every RISC-V company will be successful.
You got it. You need to do your homework, understand each company's specific strategy. What markets are they targeting? What expertise do they have? What makes them different?
Okay, so RISC-V is interesting, but it requires some extra research.
For sure. It's a bit of a wild card, but that's what makes it exciting.
All right, we've covered the big three: ARM, Buy 8664, and RISC-V. What about those other players we mentioned earlier, like Qualcomm's Snapdragon X Elite and Ampere's server processors?
Those are interesting because they're kind of a hybrid approach. Qualcomm, for instance, is using its experience with ARM to create processors that can compete with both ARM and Buy 86 in high-performance devices.
So they're aiming high.
They are. And Ampere is going all in on the cloud computing market with their ARM-based server processors.
Smart move, considering how fast that market's growing.
Exactly. And for investors, these niche players can be really interesting because they have the potential to grow really quickly if they succeed in those markets.
It's like they're finding their own space in the market instead of trying to battle the giants everywhere.
perfect analogy. And then you have the specialized players like Apple, which designs its own processors just for its devices.
Those M-series chips have been getting a lot of attention for their performance and efficiency.
They have. And Apple's strategy highlights another important point for investors: vertical integration.
Vertical integration. Break that down for me.
Well, Apple controls both the hardware and the software of their devices, so they can optimize their processors specifically for their operating system and apps, which gives them a performance and efficiency edge over companies that design processors for a wider range of systems.
So it's not just about the processor itself, it's about how it's used and how it fits into the company's overall ecosystem.
Absolutely. You need to understand the big picture, how all the pieces work together.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. What's the big takeaway for investors?
This market is constantly changing and full of opportunities. There's no single best architecture. It all depends on what you're looking for as an investor.
Right, like we talked about. ARM is great for energy efficiency, perfect for things like mobile devices and data centers.
And x86 still dominates in raw processing power, so that's where you look for things like high-performance computing.
And then you've got those disruptors trying to shake things up, like RISC-V with its open source approach, plus those niche players finding their own ways to succeed.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It really is.
But that's what makes it so exciting, right?
For sure.
So for investors, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each architecture, that's just the beginning. You need to look at the companies, their strategies, their markets, how they're innovating.
Do your due diligence. Don't just jump on the latest trend. Really understand what's driving a company's success.
Exactly. And remember, things are always changing. What's best today might be different tomorrow.
You got to stay ahead of the curve.
For sure. You need to be constantly learning, looking for new trends, new technologies, new companies that could disrupt the market.
Always be learning.
Absolutely. And think about what's coming next. We talked about existing architectures, but what about quantum computing? Neuromorphic computing?
Those are game changers.
They could completely change the landscape.
So for investors, it's not just about understanding the present. It's about anticipating the future.
Absolutely. That's where the real opportunities are.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about. This deep dive into processor architectures has been really insightful. Hopefully everyone feels a bit more equipped to make some smart investment decisions.
I hope so too. Remember, knowledge is power, especially in a fast-moving market like this. Keep learning, keep exploring. You'll be in a great position to navigate the exciting world of processor investments.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep diving deep into the knowledge that matters.